futhi ngizwisiphaniti bawo futhi siyakhuleka C'était
Good afternoon. I had notes. I had a notebook on the way to the venue, and then I left it in the car. But I think it's because Marikana lives very much in my heart. It lives deep in my soul. And my notebook probably realized that I would have lost the track if I brought it here. And when I was thinking about what I would say to you, I was reminded of a few words that Joseph Mathunjwa said on the 16th of August, probably under an hour before the massacre. And it pleaded with the miners, and it said, a black life in South Africa in Africa is cheap. They will kill us, they will finish us, they will replace us with people and pay them money that will not change a black life. And he says if that happens, we would have been defeated, and the capitalists would have won. Those were President Joseph Mathunjwa's words on the 16th of August. And I think for the miners who decided to climb down that mountain after those words, they didn't want to be defeated. And they definitely didn't want the capitalists to win. And even though those miners who heard those words are no longer with us today, we are here because of them. We are here of another 10 lives that were lost in the week from 10 to 16th of August 2012. And SERI has, I think, traversed the journey with the families of the deceased, with AMCU, the mine, with the Marikana mine workers, with the Marikana support campaign. And one of the things that happened is that in the very beginning, we could have focused on the 34 that were killed by the police on the 16th. Even we were caught in that as SERI and the families. But at least I'm certain that 10 years on, there was a rallying call across the victims who said 44 lives are no more because of capitalist greed. And they want everyone to know that Utatu Hassan Fundi, Babu Franz Mapelane, who died this day 12 years ago, are as much victims of capitalist greed as those who were gunned down by the police. And so today, we are grateful that you've honored our invitation. We are grateful to the Forge. Yvonne, when you said family, SERI at its most lowest points has been able to come to the Forge and be held. And so this is something that we are so vulnerable with. As I said, it's something that sits in our soul as an organization, as individuals. And the fact that we could partner with you on this is amazing. And to think about, just thinking about the people that are in the panel. Julian Brown, who knows, I think, the kitchen SERI, he knows where the mess is. And he managed to put together a book that would be able to communicate the struggle of Marikana to academics, to activists, to individuals, and even to people sitting in the Eastern Cape, to Koketso, Moeti, who walked with us this journey from 2012. I thought about it the other day, Koketso, that I remember one of the early days when I wondered about your intellect was reading an article you had written about Lonmin's attempts to hide their profits and make sure they avoid taxes. And to have Asenati Tukela, who's taken the baton from me and from many people who worked on the Marikana case at SERI on this panel, really, really appreciate it. But I think the one thing that today says, and seeing so many of you here, is that yes, there was a taste of defeat. There's been a million defeats along the way. And when I started, I said 44 lives. And unfortunately, since the 10th of August 2012, the door of death has remained open. It has remained open for the Marikana miners. It has remained open for the Marikana families. And so when you count deaths, it's even impossible for us to give a number because they just continued. From just on the 16th to the following week, there were stillborn children. There were parents who passed away when hearing that their sons had been killed. Even as recently as last month, we buried a son of the Julian family. So the door of death has been open. But I also want us, in counting the loss, the disruption, and the refusal of the state, to acknowledge the massacre and to acknowledge the damage they've done, to also count the victories. I think 2 years ago, not even recently, one of the Marikana widows said, you know what, we thought that 12,500 was a lot when our husbands asked for it. We have been earning it, and it's not a lot. But that person who's speaking is a cleaner at Sibanye, and they earn above 12,500 today. And that's a victory of the Marikana mine workers, the victory of the Marikana families. And I think even this meeting, the many meetings that will be held in the next few days to commemorate Marikana, is a victory because we refuse to forget until justice is done. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Yvonne, so much for having us.
Sanwanan, Njani, it's gone. Just going to do my poem, my two for now. Yoni? Sure. Dear Queen Elizabeth, I write this letter in the hope that it shall find its way to your heart, and that when you read it, your soul shall be captured by this deep admiration that I have of you, of your smile with those graceful wrinkles, queen of my crumbling castle, essence of my non-existence, apple of my black eye. Queen Elizabeth, uma ngicabanga ngawe inhliziyo yami vele igiye ngigcwala intokozo umzimba wami ngathi uyancibilika sigogwana saseNgilandi uyangenza man. Nale ncwadi ngibhala ngemanzi nte isikali sikamama uyangichaza ipeni ngilebile iphepha ngilibolekile ngibhala ngicashile akekho ngibonayo kumele wazi ukuthi ngifila kanjani. You see, Queen Elizabeth, I'm like a lion without a queen, an old wounded alpha male stripped of its horn. Ngilebhubesi elibhodla once in a blue moon nakhona to scare off these township vultures zaselokishini. My name is Glenn Dlamini. Glenn Magalagala, Glenn my dustbin, Glenn never clean, Glenn never married, Glenn never employed, Glenn never owned a thing, Glenn mavela batulaze, Glenn mavela bashalazele. Queen Elizabeth, I'm a 56-year-old ghost making his way in the shadow of the streets of the living. Angifatelwa nganex mina ngikhohlwa na ku census. Kujla malahle kama dustbin na mouse pipe makushoda amabhodlela inaba suspect Glen makulahleka isivalo sebhodo athotshe kumkhukhu kaGlen kumele ngikutse ngiphile emthangala lale mfowethu uthi kaGumede nabagundwane ngikhehle lishisayo ngistress police kaThokolo njani Glen uzonya ngakutshela ngizokubizela iCPF bona uthethe izimoto ustoka wena the toxic gossip ekwaphala emlafentisa umageza the trivial train jokes about my yellow bone teeth the Sunday school games uGlen umubi yo uGlen unculi le uGlen utiyake uGlen bamgwazi le that's me Queen Elizabeth ngilankele elingafuneki elibuliswa lingaphenduka elifrefiswa amapaving elixoshwa njengenje ezofuna ithambo eliphakela ezenkeni elingenalabana next elihamba libheke phansi likhathalana ney'ntuthwane lifunana namazuka likhonkothwa emigogo Glen ngethole emboziwe ngamaplastic elangeni ngilandela izinjana amakati ngoba izokuphela ezingunderstandayo magalagala township spider ghetto cleaner angina waste itoothbrush elahliwe idulas isivalo sepeanut butter siyabuya nezuke esikalini amabox omejisa apheshwa ngesuper glue ayidouble 6 kuSneyman i6 namazuka ziyawenza ugwayo omhlophe uyasifaka isithunzi amatamata abolile ezonke zingakabe mhlophe ngwamunya njenge orange ibisipasa libolile amasi mabola icheese mayibola ifeta indaba kabathi ukuthi ngilesikhotha ama ultra box alahliwe esimix ithatho zepiano nomithi emkhuhlane esikhalisa isikhathi universal plate ngelanga Glen instinct intutho yokwa ngizwa ngisavele ekhoneni ibox le oats ngilibona ngendlela ehleli ngakhona ukuthi alisasena something angina ntoni angina pasi angina mazinyo angina address Queen Elizabeth na 16 years ngagcina ukugibela itaxi ngisatha sasemjondolo nje ngikozana ngama direction uyabona sibali mawufike khona le 3 uzohlala nenye ankele egqoka isport sePilo Plaza sesimbashile nenqaza ekhotro ubuze wena ukuthi crash ngakuphi angihleki nyamayizisa angihambi ngiyasastepa angiphili ngiphelezela abaphilayo and Queen Elizabeth khona abashana abangifadelayo abazi ukuthi ngilankele ehloniphayo lankele ethumayo lankele ngamind ukushutha izithombe bengenza inhlekisa kulama social project wabo ama Facebook nama Twitter uthando lwami forona iyokuphela into engikhuthazayo engeze ngiqhubeke ngofake ngokhiphe umoya in the hope that you might end my plight bring light and love in my heart is it in despair that I write or does love know no boundaries is love acceptance does love judge is it class is it money can a queen love a hobo? Can a king love a plebeian? Can a priest love a prostitute? I am the one who will restore the lost pride of this lion and give me back my title of king. Will you read this letter with open mind, Mar? My sweet English spoken. I have written out to Spaza. The telephone number is a public phone in Nguzalanga, waiting for your call. I look forward to hearing from you. With love, Glen Dlamini. Ulele igolile abantu ulele umAfrika uphupha inyoni zezulu namhlanje sisazungeza phezulu kwegazi likaTaki uphupha kamnandi uphupha isikhange sinamaflana uka kamnandi uphupha ama days uphupha amakhala film ama Christmas amnandi Takwe kamnandi umAfrika omuhle takwe evangeli takwe indlala takwe isembiso sikaMandela nabashana bakhe baseluthula bahudula amakula namajuda ngesenta takwe isikoloto saseNetbank takwe inhlambazo nonkwe wesishwapho ombiza ngemfene ezweni lakhe umAfrika uphefumula ngepermission kaOppenheimer amphethe amaqaqa ezweni lakhe amkala nokuthi kumele aphefumule kangaki ngehora takwe incwadi zamangisi namajuda takwe Shakespeare takwe Karl Marx akafundile umAfrika utakiwe utakwe isingisi uphupha nangaso umAfrika ondlebe sikhanyila ngelimtaka bamfundisa ukuthanda incindezelo usebenza kayi-30 uhola kayi-1 uvuka kayi-30 ulala kayi-1 akanyathela uyagega makakhala uyahleka utshani bencindezelo buyamkitaza uzitiphele kamnandi umAfrika omuhle uphupha kamnandi phupha ama-sweet pumpkins phupha imiqamela yama-silk uyakhona umAfrika ambulela uSamora uyakhona umAfrika bambulela uSankara uyakhona umAfrika usabela kasekho thina mfoka sobuka singamagwala siyashalaza zicela insekelo elizulu zayan van Riebeck ophama ingelosi South Africa azana wabulala uGaddafi Joslovo qhawe South Africa yazana wathenga isizwe lama-Afrika nge-2 eClip Town yajive eSouth Africa yazana kuyasha ulele phezu kwekazi lamaqhawe namagwala amnyama ulele umAfrika igoli liyabanda. Thank you.
So as Yvonne's already said, we are really grateful that you've all made it here today to commemorate the 12th anniversary of the Marikana massacre with us. We have a panel of wonderful people who, in their own ways, are experts. I mean, you can't really be an expert on such a horrible thing, but they do have really valuable things that they can share with us. So as Nomzamo said, the 10th of August in 2012 was the day the strike started. And then, as you know, people lost their lives on the 10th. People also lost their lives on the 13th of August. And then it culminated on D-Day, the 16th of August, when 34 mine workers were killed at Scene 1 at the Kopi, and then Scene 2 later on when they were hunted down. So to introduce my panelists, I will start on the far end. Koketso Moeti is the founding executive director of Amandla.mobi, which is an organization that leads campaigns that challenge injustice and build real power for Black people. And she's a long-standing friend and family member of SERI. So please give her a round of applause. In the middle, we have Asenati Tukela. He's an attorney at the Socio-Economic Rights Institute. And he's the lead attorney who's been leading the case, took over from Zamo, as she mentioned, where we represent the 36 families. Asenati has a long background in activism, and he's been bringing that to SERI. So. And then closest to me, we have Julian Brown, who's an associate professor in the politics department at Wits. And he is the author of Marikana, A People's History, which was published about 2 years ago. I know that Yonela opened us off in prayer, but I would just like us to take a moment of silence. One, for the lives that we're remembering, the 44 who lost their lives at Marikana, but also for, as you may have heard from Nomzamo, Aphelele Jokanisi was also killed by the police not too long ago. And that is the brother to Semi Jokanisi, who was killed on the 13th of August. So could we just have a moment to just think of them? Thank you. So how we'll do this is I will ask the panelists a series of questions, and then at some point we'll open up for Q&A where you guys can also pick their brains. But I would like to start with Julian, who poured over a wealth of material that covers what happened when the massacre took place, all the material that came out of the Commission of Inquiry. And in the book, if you haven't had a chance to read it, it tells for the first time the story of Marikana from the perspective of the miners and their families. So what I would like to ask you, Julian, is how would you characterize the state's handling and their response to the massacre in the immediate aftermath with the Commission of Inquiry and basically getting us to this point where we're still saying the same thing 12 years later?
Thanks, Tata. How would I characterize the state's response to Marikana? That is a loaded question. Abysmal. In the immediate aftermath and 12 years later. The state has not done nothing, but it has done nothing sufficient. And in the early days, in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, the state's first and most pressing response was to try to limit the damage, hide the political impact of it, make the people who died an anonymous mass, emphasize that they must have been violent or else they would not have been killed. They sought in the days and weeks and months immediately following the massacre through the Ministry of Police, through Ria Piega, and through, if not quite as explicit statements, certainly the consent of President Zuma at the time, to paint the dead as the aggressors and to suggest that the police were merely defending themselves, that the police had acted within lawful force, that the world was being held hostage by violent miners. And that was simply a lie. There is nothing to say to it other than it is a complete lie. Was there violence in a week-long strike of several thousand people? Of course there was. People died in the run-up to the massacre. They were killed by some mine workers, but they were not killed by 3,000 mine workers acting together. They were not killed by every man who was on that kopie. And at no point on the day of the massacre were the police ever in danger from the workers. The workers were retreating. The workers had taken Joseph Matunjwa's advice and warning to heart and were leaving the kopie when they were shot at by police acting well beyond the bounds of what constitutes lawful force without any immediate threat. And yes, the state's response was to blame the dead. Over time, that immediate stereotyping, that immediate libel of the dead has faded away, but it hasn't faded away because the state changed its mind. It faded away because activists, lawyers, community members, and many other sympathetic people continually challenged that story and made it impossible for the state to keep speaking with a straight face about the guilt of the dead. Over time, we have had some almost apologies for the state's actions, but no real apologies. There have been, through SERI, and I'm sure Asenati will speak more to this in a moment, some attempts to hold some members of the state responsible, of the police forces in particular, and attempts to gain some sort of formal compensation for the dead. But every single thing that has been won has been demanded and fought for. The state has never fully acknowledged its responsibility. The state has never fully engaged with the families, and everything that has been achieved, which is not nothing, but is not enough, has been achieved because the state has been held to account by the families themselves and by the civil society movements that support them.
Thank you. So Asenati, I would like you to maybe share how, in your work with the families, what have been some of your own personal reflections on their experiences and the ways in which they've been failed?
Thank you, Tato. And thank you to everyone who has made time to come and hear us speak on Marikana today. I think in the last 4 years I've been working on the case. My reflection would be a reflection of pain and suffering For me, the struggle of Marikana resonates a lot with me, given my circumstances and where I come from and my background. The entirety of the mining sector in the country is built on the back of migrant labor, migrant cheap labor. And when an injustice like Marikana occurs, you get to see how very little valued cheap and migrant labor is in the country. And because of that as a background, it is also easy for you to see the pain and the suffering in the widows, in the children, in the families. And it is also very easy for you to resonate with that pain and that suffering. So for me, my utmost reflection on Marikana is the pain and the suffering that I see in the widows every time we interact with them. The pain and the suffering that I see from the children of the deceased mine workers every time we interact with them. The pain and the suffering that still remains within extended members of the families of the deceased mine workers. My other reflection on Marikana personally would be the destruction of families as a result of Marikana, which I think is not something we speak about a lot when we reflect and we speak about Marikana. Not only were fathers and husbands killed, breadwinners taken away from their families, but there was also a significant destruction of the families. Because if you understand what migrant labor is and how it looks like, the father is forced to migrate away from home so as to provide some socio-economic security to the family. And what Marikana caused is the deprivation of that breadwinner from the family, and a huge gap, a huge vacuum being left with the family to now find their own means of socio-economic security. And as a result of that, the widows had to take up that responsibility. And just after Marikana, because of that gap and that vacuum, there was a negotiation between the families and the mine with the intention of at least securing the socio-economic security of the families and ensuring that they remain stable. But the consequence of that was the destruction in the family, because it meant now the widow, who would ideally be at home taking care of the children and the household, would now have to migrate to Marikana. And not only migrate, but exist in a space where there is pain and suffering, and there is very little to no justice for that pain and suffering which was deliberately caused upon them by the state. So it's almost impossible to deny the destruction that Marikana caused on the families. And what happened after that destruction, because I think it kept multiplying over the years. But one other issue is the issue of inequality. I think whenever we speak about the problems we have in this country, we try to remove those issues from the issue of inequality. I think Marikana was the most blatant exhibition of inequality in this country. We were able to, as my colleague here is saying, we were able to at least witness an exhibition of private capital versus labor. And we saw who has the bigger and the upper hand in that scenario. But before I go, I think I should also highlight the lack of justice. I will speak further on that as we go. The lack of acknowledgement by the state of what Marikana is. In the next week, and I can bet you on this, we are going to be hearing a lot about Marikana on the news. And every media institution, every state organization that describes Marikana describes it as a tragedy, as an unfortunate event, as a clash, as a confrontation. They give it every other fancy name except for a massacre. And I think that lack of acknowledging Marikana as a massacre tends to cause the state to forget and to ignore the actual pain and the suffering and the damage that was caused by Marikana. And lastly, maybe I would touch on the lack of closure and the lack of healing. It's almost impossible to find healing and closure when there is no justice for the atrocities caused upon you. So I think in the last 4 years going forward for me, that has been my reflection. And it is a picture that I see in every single widow's face whenever we interact with them. You see the pain, you see the suffering. And no matter how strong they try to hold themselves together, you can see the pain, you can see the suffering. And I don't think none of that will change until we realize meaningful justice and reparations for the families. Thank you.
Thank you, Asenati. Koketso, you've done a lot of work around the area of Marikana. Could you speak about what the conditions of the town, Marikana, reflect about the conditions elsewhere in South Africa?
In many ways, Marikana is a microcosm of South Africa. Everything you see elsewhere transpires there. The exploitation of labor, the living conditions, and so on. What is important to remember is that before any mine worker and police officer came face to face with each other on that day, before the strike even took place, the conditions had been set for that to happen. And it happened because there was an absence of services. It happened because there was a mine that was not paying people adequately. It happened because of poor working conditions. It happened for a variety of reasons that were outside of both parties' hands. But what did happen is that when the mine workers stood up for themselves and demanded better, private capital was able to move the state to act to protect it against the very people it is meant to serve. And we see that happening beyond Marikana. Between January 2017 and July 2018, there were 1,000 confirmed cases of listeriosis in this country. Over 200 people died. It is the largest outbreak in modern history. But the backstory of that, the state had attempted to put in place regulations on the cold meat industry to standardize the process. Big business, their proxies, and a whole range of private interests acted against it. Essentially, once again, colluding with the state, resulting in mass death. That is but one example of many others I can name where we see the conditions back then being reflected. In 2012, when the mine workers decided to strike, they demanded a living wage. In 2024, in the lead up to an election, we saw an opposition party that is now part of the so-called Government of National Unity opposing, campaigning on the basis of scrapping a minimum wage. 12 years later, the lessons have not been learned. The conditions that were present in Marikana remain present in many other communities beyond mining towns. We're talking about the delivery of services, we're talking about the state collusion, every aspect of it, the exploitation of labor, and so on. So the demand for the justice for Marikana goes beyond the massacre. It is a demand for justice outside of Marikana as well, and that is important to always remember.
Thank you so much. So Julian, I want to go back to you a little bit. 1 second. You've written, and I think this may connect in some ways to what Koketso just said, but as someone who's written extensively about protest, particularly the ways in which protest can sometimes fall outside of the bounds of the accepted frameworks, in what ways did the strike challenge the, don't do that, challenge the dominant commercial and government arrangements and interests, and what lessons can we draw from the strike? So, Marikana, they refused a lot of things, and for many reasons the strike was important because it just rejected the existing frameworks. What can we take from that? Good and bad lessons. Not bad in the sense that we judge anyone, but what does it tell us about the limits of our framework and that?
Thanks. I am hesitant to provide lessons or instructions. What I can say is that... Loud enough? Okay. What I can say is that there is always more than one thing happening when people strike. There is the immediate circumstance, the immediate context that makes this strike happen at this moment. The collapse of a working labor bargaining framework in Marikana, the lack of a living wage, the particular absence of services. That is part of why people strike and protest, but it's never the whole of it. Because to protest is to insist that your voice, your agency, your intelligence, your understanding of the world matters, it counts, and it must be recognized. Yes, people are striking because they are lacking services, but they're also striking because it is the only way in democracy for their voices to be heard. Protest is the fundamental element or right of any democracy. If we cannot protest, if we cannot insist on being heard, and if we are shot for doing so, we don't have a democracy. So, is there a lesson here? The lesson is, if there is any, is a simple one. Speak. Every speech brings with it risks, and there is no such thing as a safe protest. Because every protest, every time people who are not ordinarily recognized as having the ability to explain and describe their own circumstances, to explain what is wrong with the world, and to insist that they know what can be done to fix it. Every time people who are not experts, who are not university academics, who are not professional politicians speak, the boundaries of our ordinary everyday democracy are pushed a bit further. And that is always a challenge and will often result in violent or otherwise exclusionary actions. But without it, we have nothing.
Thank you. Asenati, I would like you to maybe share with the audience what we mean beyond, well, it's a little different to what Koketso was saying, which is justice for Marikana in the broader sense. But for the families, what has justice for Marikana meant? So in pursuit of criminal justice or justice via the criminal justice system and pursuing justice via the civil avenues, what has that meant? What does your work really entail?
Yes, thanks, Tato. I think the first thing we must mention is that the victims of Marikana are much, much broader than the families. On the 2 days of Marikana, there were mine workers who were shot and killed. There were mine workers who were also shot and injured, but not deceased. There were mine workers who were unlawfully arrested as a result of Marikana. So the Justice Project for Marikana is a much wider, open-ended project. And it takes the form of two aspects, the civil aspect and the criminal aspect. And I'll start with the criminal aspect because it is important for all of us to collectively criticize the state for their failures to realize justice for Marikana. The nature of criminal prosecutions is in its form dependent on the state. But when this system came about, we all imagined a state that is concerned about protecting human rights, a state that is concerned about protecting its people, and most importantly, a state that is very much concerned about not repeating the atrocities of the apartheid government. So when it comes to criminal, and as we know that there were events in Marikana on the 13th of August, which resulted in the death of a few mine workers and police officers. There hasn't been justice for the events of the 13th of August. Then there was the actual massacre on the 16th of August. There hasn't even been a single criminal prosecution that has ensued in court in relation to the events of the 16th of August. So 12 years later, after 44 mine workers and police officers and security personnel died, there hasn't been any meaningful efforts towards realization of meaningful justice for Marikana. And when we speak about this lack of justice in relation to criminal efforts, we must be able to criticize the state, and we must do so vigorously. Because it is the state that fails entirely to bring about prosecutions in court. And when we do criticize the state for this, we must do so unashamedly, because there is elements of protection of certain individuals who should be facing the music for Marikana. In relation to the civil, which on behalf of the families, on behalf of the widows, on behalf of the children, on behalf of the brothers, the mothers, the fathers of the deceased mine workers, a civil lawsuit was launched in 2015 after the Marikana Commission. And I'm going to expand on that because I need this particular process to be understood. And my hope for that is because it seems that no matter the conversations, no matter the discussions, we just can't cut through the logic of the state in making them understanding these issues. When we brought about the civil case, we did it in 5 prayers or 5 demands. The first, which is the most important in my opinion, is the issue of the apology. The first demand was that at least someone from the state must come speaking on behalf of government of South Africa, sit down with the families, the widows, the children, and tender an apology. An apology that shows that there is acknowledgement and understanding of what Marikana is and what Marikana caused to those families. A sincere apology that is followed by reparations and justice for the atrocities of Marikana. The second demand was loss of support. The deceased mine workers were not just violent protesters who didn't want to go to work and wanted to be on the streets. They were breadwinners to their wives, to their children, to their brothers, to their siblings, to their mothers and fathers. Despite how little they were paid, they provided for these people. And their brutal murder meant that socio-economic security has been taken away from these families. The third was emotional shock and psychological damage and injury. The fourth being grief and emotional suffering. Because these speak to the actual pain and suffering caused by the events that happened in Marikana. And despite how much these are disputed by the state, there is actual pain that remains to this day, and we can see it. You can witness it in the children, you can witness it in the widows and the families. There is still pain and psychological damage. The last one, which is much more disputed on the side of the state, is the loss of parental care by the minor children and the loss of spousal support for the widows. We brought these demands because we understood that they clearly summarize the pain and the suffering that was caused by Marikana upon these families. But much above this, because this is a collective litigation process, what I want to break down for everyone to understand is the personal and the individualistic pain that each and every person suffered from the 320 that we represent out of Marikana. Because the pain and the suffering was felt individually. Despite the solidarity, despite the event affecting different families and different persons, the pain remains individual. When the news, and I will apologize if I become emotional, when the news of Marikana came, one of the families, the Sokanyile family, the mother of the deceased mine worker, collapsed and was rushed to hospital. She did not even make it to hospital, she died before arriving at hospital as a result of the trauma of the news and not being able to emotionally handle what was being brought to her. The Monesa family, a widow from Lesotho, she was 9 months pregnant when her husband died in Marikana. She gave birth a few weeks later, but the baby did not make it. And no one would dare convince me that the events of Marikana are not connected to these events. The Joganisi family lost their firstborn son, Semi Joganisi, at Marikana, who was their breadwinner. A few years after Marikana, we went back to the mine to beg that they, at least in the meantime, take care of the children of the deceased mine workers. And they graciously agreed to at least put them through school. And it really goes back to the issue of inequality for me, because a very well-resourced mining company takes you to school. And by default, they're going to put you into a fancy school that you wouldn't otherwise afford if your father hadn't died in Marikana. In a school where your classmates fully afford being here, which means there's going to be evident class differences between you and the other children. As a result of this, the son of Semi Joganisi, Ayabonga Kregeka, was bullied so much that as a young teenager committed suicide as a result of this, which evidently shows that Marikana goes beyond the 13th and the 16th of August 2012. There is circumstantial events that occur as a result of Marikana. And all of these, they go back to the pain and suffering which hasn't been addressed by the state. The Marikana trauma hasn't escaped the widows, the children, the families. They went from hearing the news and accepting the reality that there is no immediate justice for Marikana. They sat through the commission of inquiry, and on the daily basis they were reminded of their pain, they were reminded of their suffering, they were reminded of their psychiatric injury, they were reminded of their loss. And when the commission ended, they still received no meaningful justice from government, which prompted the launching of the civil case. And I wanted to bring this background so that I can break down the actual pain, the actual trauma, the actual suffering, and the psychiatric injury that exists with the widows, with the children, and with the families of the deceased mine workers. A few weeks ago, if not a month ago, we received sad news from the Joganisi family. Tatu Goodman Joganisi lost his first son in Marikana, and then his grandson to suicide as a result of bullying because of Marikana. A month ago, the police in the Eastern Cape shot and killed another son of his. When we called Tatu Joganisi to try and understand the facts surrounding this event, the first thing he said to us on the phone was, "Mntanam, I'm a police and pindile futhi." And every single time I interact with any of the widows, any of the families, every time I get a phone call before I pick it up, those words, they ring in my head. Because at the center of Marikana is the police. It's public order policing, it's policing of mass gatherings, it's policing of protests. And the real issue is the failure of police to follow standards, to follow procedures, to follow principles, which are there, they are existing, they exist as policies, but there is just a deliberate failure to follow these procedures. I'm going to hold it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Asenati. Koketso, I think in what you were alluding to about how much further collusion between private and state goes, speak a little bit about what Marikana reveals about that relationship between the state and private interest.
One of the things Julian mentioned in his earlier response was about the dismal response of the state in the immediate aftermath, right? I want to extend it a little bit. Professor Jane Duncan did an analysis of news reports in the immediate aftermath and found that most of the sources that were being cited were police officers, the mining company itself, and so on. Everybody but the mine workers, everybody but the striking folks, and so on. I would take it as far as saying that why it was important to disrupt that narrative and humanize the mine workers, right, was because it was an attempt to manufacture consent that when people protest, it is okay to deal with them in those ways. And that, for me, is a powerful example of private interests and the state working together to undo that expansion of democratic space that Julian was referring to earlier. Again, there are many more examples beyond Marikana, beyond even protest. And I want to bring your attention to when the lockdown happened in South Africa following the discovery of COVID-19 here. Within 3 days or 4 days of the lockdown having taken place, there were more people killed by the police and the army than had died of COVID. Multiple examples that compel that we ask, who is the state there to protect and who does the state serve? And repeatedly, we see the state acting in collusion with private interests to protect profits and not the people meant to be served. Beyond Marikana and the examples I have named, we have seen big business, its proxies and other private interests block access to cheaper medication, continue wage theft in this country, continue the ways of tax avoidance that is a collective good that should be serving us, amongst many, many other things. These are not consequence-free, as Marikana should always remind us. This collusion is deadly at worst, and even when not deadly, it costs lives. Asenati was talking about the impacts beyond those who died as a result of the police hands. Just to expand it, in the immediate aftermath of Marikana, there was a de facto state of emergency within the community. And during the protests that followed thereafter, Paulina Moshulo was killed. Amongst the people who were shot was also a young man who was bringing his uncle lunch, who was a mine worker at Marikana. So as has been pointed out, the consequences extend so much. And the fact that this continues to happen and be the norm today should really scare us all. But again, it was so important to disrupt all those narratives because we cannot allow that consent to be manufactured, that it is okay for the state and private interests to collude in that way and kill in the interest and defense of nothing but profit.
Thank you. So I'd like to open it up now. If you have any comments or questions that you'd like to pose to the panel, you may raise your hands. I think we'll do them in a series of 3, and maybe we'll do 3 rounds, but I am going to plead with you. Keep it tight.
Thank you. I may find it difficult to keep it tight, but my name is David and I'm an attorney, and unfortunately I've often been involved in shooting incidents concerning the police and the army. And I want to look at the 2 things, the trauma for the victims, but I also want to look at what happens to the soldiers or police that do the shooting. I'm going to go back to 1984, which was bad apartheid days. Victoria Mkenge was murdered on the 4th of August 1984 in eThekwini, Durban. The unrest and the state of making the nation ungovernable started in KZN, spread right through to the East Rand. The rest of the country had been a few years ahead of KZN. There were two things I noted. One, the white conscripts were quite shocked. I think they were shocked at the poverty of the townships, because whites didn't go into townships. So they were shocked at the poverty of the townships. They were shocked at the degree of violence, which was more burning down of shacks and houses. I can recall seeing a young man standing with a big pile of stones and petrol bombs, and he waved when I drove past, but when the police came, he used his missiles. But they were shocked. Then the police brought up the riot squad from the Eastern Cape, who'd become hardened because they'd been deployed in Zwede and New Brighton. And I was shocked at their brutality. They actually had lost feeling. They drove with the doors of their vehicles open, but with a foot on the door, so it looked closed, with a shotgun across their laps, so they could shoot immediately if they wished. They'd have a braaivleis in the middle of the township. Forget about the poor starving people around them, because they wanted to eat. I remember them going around Chesterville, which is a township basically part of Westville, with a vehicle which had a big fan on it, and they sprayed tear gas powder. Not tear gas, tear gas powder, so that the dogs and the chickens were choking. But they just had no feeling at all. So that I saw there. Then the Bishu massacre on the 7th of September 1992, just before the new South Africa. So it was still under the old apartheid government. You're talking about a protest of 70,000 people, motivated and rallied by Chris Hani. You were talking, if you just look, well, the first thing there that was interesting, there was a criminal prosecution. The Attorney General wanted to prosecute the commander of the soldiers who gave the order. He also wanted to prosecute Ronnie Cashros for leading the charge into Bishu, therefore to the shooting. And then the head of the police, who hadn't secured the stadium and closed all the barbed wire, which allowed a gap for the crowd to rush through. And the fourth accused was a soldier who fired rifle grenades. And that shrapnel, when it explodes, can wound or kill a lot of people. He had a few other soldiers who had fired more than 10 sort of rounds each, but he left that. And it ended up that in 2001, so it was 9 years afterwards, they did prosecute. They prosecuted the commander and the soldier who fired the rifle grenades. Our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was one of the witnesses. I was a witness. Ronnie Cashros was a witness, but they were found not guilty. But at least there was a criminal prosecution. And I don't think it was the fault of the Attorney General at the time. This was many years afterwards. The thing with the civil claims, and Asenati, I wanted to check this with you. I found the state will often use prescription. You haven't instituted your action in time. In the old days, there was a limitation of actions. If you're suing the police or the army, you had to do it within 6 months. And I think that applied to Bishu. So, and then they use special pleas and exceptions. You normally sort it all out, and you still have your day in court, but it's a waste of time and it's a waste of money, because your clients can't afford lawyers, and the state has got the state attorney there, and they can brief advocates at 65,000 rand a day, which they do. So I find that abusive, and it's maybe we sort of need almost a rules of engagement for litigation. Then there were 2 shootings at Fort Hare University, which am I going too long? Okay.
I'm going to have to get another person to come in. If we
Okay.
have time, perhaps we can get back to you. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you very much, colleagues. My name is Msiwa Madiga. I am a researcher at Robdin Law, but I'm not representing them today. I have 3 questions.
Can you make it one, and then we can come back?
Okay. I've done some work in the absence of Ubuntu in the service delivery protests. Every protest has its own, superficial peculiarities. And these superficial peculiarities would then fit into what I call the identity of a protest. I'm interested in knowing the identity of Marikana, and therefore my question would be, what distinguishes Marikana protest from other protests that took place in South Africa post-apartheid? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi. How? Okay. Thank you. Hello. Hi. I'm Linda Dlamini, pronounced they, them. So I wanted to ask a personal question to all of you, if you're willing to answer, of course, which is, how do you do the work? How do you continue to be here to still advocate for all these people that have died at Marikana and all those families that are left behind without losing hope, without getting absolutely depressed and not wanting to do the work anymore? So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So, panelists, I don't know if you got the first one. It sounded like state tactics. And it was mostly a comment, but I think there's something about what the state has been doing, perhaps in this case, to either avoid, I don't know, maybe that's my interpretation.
Thank you for the engagement. I'll start with the first question on the delay tactics that we have encountered in the process. So soon after the civil case was launched, the state called us to negotiations, and we all positively thought that this would be the approach in which we settle this matter. So we went for negotiations with the aim of settling the matter. At the start of the negotiations, we opened with the loss of support aspect of the claim, which we thought was a little too obvious. The deceased mine workers were breadwinners. They were providing socio-economic support to their families, and that was quite obvious. We then went through calculations of the value of the support that each mine worker was providing to their family. And to that extent, we were sort of 90% successful. So building on the positive outcomes of the loss of support settlement, we were of the opinion, because the state was suggesting so, that we would perhaps settle the outstanding demands that we made in our papers. 3 years after the negotiation of the outstanding demands went by, and we sort of had to sit down and assess whether we are making any measurable inroads in the discussions with the state. And we all collectively, with the widows and with the families, realized that we are going to keep going back and forth with the state, because the real issue was that there was no willingness on their side to settle the matter, or at least no willingness to settle the matter with the idea of achieving meaningful justice. So we had to revert the matter back to court, and that's where we are now. So those are the nature of the delay tactics that we have experienced in the road. I wouldn't rule out the possibilities of special pleas and exceptions, and I apologize to the non-lawyer audiences. The second question around Ubuntu in protests, and I think that the real issue is whether in the de-escalation of protests by police, is there any humanity on their side? is there any recognition and respect for human rights on their side? And it is easy to answer that question because every mass protest we've witnessed in this country has resulted in gross violations of human rights, which clearly display to us that there is a huge lack of respect and acknowledgement of human rights. The Marikana protest was, from the get-go, characterized as a very violent protest that has the intentions of overthrowing the state or disrupting the mining industry. When in fact, if you try to understand the actual demands of the workers, they were basically demanding for a living wage, 12,500, which at the time when they achieved the 12,500, there was no longer the value of 12,500 attached to that salary. They were simply demanding for basic services, proper accommodation, decent working environment. And I mean, from those demands and assessing those demands and understanding them better, you realize that if there was Ubuntu not only on the side of the police, but on the side of the state, on the side of the mine itself, this wouldn't have resulted in a mass deadly event like Marikana. But also I think that the real issue with the police is the fact that ideologically we've never really transformed from the apartheid force into a democratic dispensation of police. We almost adopted the same procedures, the same languaging, the same characteristics, the same classification of ranks, the same almost everything. And I'm sure Nganyiso would agree. Kwame Nkrumah speaks about the uniform complex, and that whenever you give someone a position of power where they are identified differently from everyone, they start acting with a bit of peril over the general public. And when you adopt a system of policing from the previous regime, and you do very little to overhaul the entire system, the police start approaching mass protest in the way that they did in Marikana, the same way they did in Fees Must Fall, the same way they do in every other event. It results in injury, it results in death, it results in gross violations of human rights. I think that...
How do you do your work?
Honestly, you know the beauty about sitting in a panel is that you have power to even put your boss under the bus. But I will say that for me, the work that I do really is not much detached from the work that I did before I became a professional. I was an activist before I became a professional. I was on the ground and in the forefront in Fees Must Fall. And despite how depressing and how violent it was, we still carried through because we understood that the idea we carry needs to be realized at some point. I think it is the same for Marikana. The Justice Project for Marikana is so close related to my politics and to my personhood. And as a result, I do not need to recharge and get some solidarity elsewhere. It is within me. But it would be remiss not to mention all of the different people, different organizations, activists that support us and provide solidarity to SERI and to the people who work in Marikana. But I think I must highlight this, that our biggest source of strength is the widows. Our biggest source of strength is the families and the children. I haven't worked with people who have displayed so much strength, even in the midst of adversity like Marikana, in the midst of lack of justice and lack of acknowledgement of what Marikana is. The widows remain strong and they remain committed to the project for justice for Marikana. Thank you.
1 second, sir. 1 second.
Guidelines for the handling of protests. And I don't think we need to go any further. That's very clear. But do they use it at Police College?
Okay.
Let me answer two of the questions that were asked in the first round. The first one is what sets Marikana apart? One answer is nothing. Every protest is a threat. But there is another answer that I think is important here, and it's what sets Marikana apart within the context of labor and mining protests. And that is, at Marikana, the protesters, the workers, rejected not just capital, not just the state, but also the union structures. They sought to protest spontaneously without going through the NUM or AMCU. AMCU's solidarity in the aftermath has given it a degree of legitimacy, but they were not part of the strike. No union was. And that is one of the reasons why the strikers at Marikana were so vulnerable to police violence and to the cruelty and the libelous descriptions of them afterwards, because no institutionalized source of power was defending them. Not many a mining strike turns violent, but when unions are involved, there is a second source of recognized and institutional power that has a say in how the miners are treated. It is imperfect, but it exists. In Marikana in 2012, the unions, I won't go so far as to say actively complicit in the deaths, but they were certainly not standing in the way of the police. And you asked a question about how anyone does this work. There is no such thing as a universal answer. Every answer has to be deeply personal. I find it very hard to talk about this material 12 years later. But what makes me do it is really recognizing how tiny my role in this is. I get to write, I get to speak, and I get to reframe other people's words in a way that a different audience, an audience who does not listen to the words of the widows, who does not listen to the words of the miners, might listen because I have a title, I have an official position, and I sound like this. That is what I can do. What I can't do is what Asenati does. What I can't do is what Nomzamo does. What I can't do is what Koketso does. And it's okay because we are all working together. And if you try to take on full responsibility for anything, you will fail. But if you can understand that you're part of a community of people committed to a broader project and that your role is a small one, it becomes, at least for me, a lot easier to keep going.
Koketso, do you want to, please?
So one of the things for me, at least, is I think just, Asenati was talking about the lack of addressing what policing looks like, from the apartheid regime until now and so on. I think also we have narrow understandings of how our institutions were formed, right? Before there was apartheid, there was colonialism, right? And these things are deeply intertwined. The creation of the prison system in South Africa is deeply tied to the provision of labor to the mines, right? And so they are all of these things about how our institutions were formed in the first place that we haven't quite fully reckoned with. And so the outcomes in many ways are not surprising. These systems, the police, are actually acting in the ways they were designed to act, despite all of the regulations. It is actually not an aberration or an anomaly. By design, this was the purpose of police, to protect certain groups of people, to protect certain interests, to protect, and until we reckon with that and deeply engage with the fact that we still live with those deeply colonial institutions and history that are not only existent but are being reproduced, and new forms of them are also being reproduced, I think we're going to have a problem. We actually do have to have a reckoning about actually these institutions, the ways that they work, all of this, what must be done, But yeah, it is not an aberration of the system. Actually, all of these things are working exactly how they were designed to be working.
Thank you so much. Okay, so noting the second question, Who else would like to? There's one here, then there's one here, and then there's 3 here. Yeah. And then one more. So we've combined round 2 and 3.
I can start?
Yeah.
Okay. Greetings to the House, all protocol reserved. My question is, after everything that is being deliberated right now to the panel, is do we still see protest as a strategy for us to get our voices heard? Or should we now consider what Abahlali baseMjondolo considers litigation? Because they say that when they go to the streets, their lives are in danger and they're killed. And in courts, their voices will be heard and they won't be killed. Now the question becomes then, which cases are going to be prioritized and which issues are going to be adjudicated? We have a problem. We are sitting with a matter that hasn't been adjudicated for the past 12 years. Do we still have faith in our judicial system, or we do not, right? And moving further, we have an issue of whereby it is also demonstrated as a threat to say the moment you go and protest in the streets, even university-wise. We had the case of Mdumba adjudicated, and they said that they haven't had enough evidence to, prosecute. There was a video that was circulating, pretty much clear. Whether or not there's a question of admissibility of it as evidence in the court, it's something that we were not told as the public. So right now, my question is, do we still regard, marching at the expense of our lives being taken by the very same people that are meant to protect as a strategy to continue to raise our grievances to the public?
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Sanmonani, Ninjani. My name is Sunshine. I'm a writer and a scholar. So I actually saw the documentary. I was in high school when the documentary dropped, and we went as a school to go see it. And it was quite shocking because you're seeing a body of somebody you saw like 12 minutes alive, and then 12 minutes later, they are dead on the ground. I actually don't have a question, but it's more of a statement. To say, I feel like people think that these things fall upon other human beings because it's indicative of your character as a person, but these are things that could fall on anyone. You could be at work and you're not happy about how things are going. So for people that have been fighting for these people, like, we are thankful. To everybody here today, we are very thankful because it has been 12 years. People have not gotten justice on people that, were close to them. So it matters, you guys waking up to still stand, us also as a people, to still stand with everyone and everything that happens. It means a lot, because in this life you don't choose. It might fall on you next, and then who's going to stand with you when it happens? Like, this is a very big moment in life, and with what has gone down, and as a people moving forward. So I highly appreciate being here today with everybody that is here, and with the people that are fighting it on the low side, and just being there for the families, because I can't imagine what it must be like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there was...
Yumelang?
Okay.
No offense. So the previous lady, she basically took my comment.
Great, so we can...
But then again, I do want to say thank you to the panel and the work that you guys are doing. Because in my view, I think the larger part of society, we allow ourselves to forget about these human rights issues. Because I think if something happens, it'll be on the news from Monday to Friday. By Thursday, we're like, you know what, we can change and go to maybe Scandal or Rhythm City right now, because it's been happening, we know about it. And I think, thank you guys for bringing them up over and over again so that their memory is not diminished, and so that they keep on living, so that more people can hear the news and try to do more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Tobela le kae?
Le kae?
Rona ke nna Matsobane. Nkosinathi, my brother. Question yaka, it's in relation to accounting. Ma?
Asenati.
Oh, tshwarela, Asenati. Question yaka, it's in relation to accountability towards the mine le port ya ona, because of every day, you know, when we hear the reports from the news, it's always, only the state must be held accountable. But deep down, we do know that even the company, I mean, the mine, actually, we all know the mine, the board, you know, even some of the board members, they're also involved in this thing. So, question, what steps have you taken to hold the board accountable besides the issue of no? School fees or and then there's also a narrative happening in society in relation to Marikana. You know, for someone who's telling Marikana, every time Marikana, no, by the good king, and then Ngakabagali came invisible. And that narrative pushing media. So, how do we then, or I mean, at what extent, Leona, do you hold then the media accountable? Because of they do, created narratives, ordinary members of society, big sarute or big understand or Marikana. The fact that no invisible, that is why we ban Yoba, Hama put it about twin. Kito Velegar, but why be by Yoba? Be invisible, but you realize, to a certain extent, media it needs to be held accountable on how they report on these things. So, what steps have you taken to hold the media also accountable? Galebo.
Yeah, ngiyanibingelela uzwelibanzwa waDubelo abahlali basemjondolo eThembisa. You know, I've been saying this for the past 46 years, and I'm still saying it, that as long as we still have capitalism and imperialism globally, we will not be able to change the system that will govern globally. Because one, if you look at what the government of the past was doing, they were doing what they called evictions. Now they've given it a new name. They call it relocation. Relocation to where? To which country? So we'll be fighting the very same system for as long as we live, as long as capitalism and imperialism is still in power. Because we know what happened in Marikana was perpetrated by the system, because the very same government that we say we voted for is the government that is protecting the profits of these people and not the lives of the people of this country. So what I'm trying to say is, I think one of the most decorated revolutionaries of our time, I think it was Thomas Sankara, who said, a soldier without political knowledge is a potential criminal. So that's what you should expect from the police. You shouldn't expect a policeman to be a civilian, but a policeman will always remain a criminal as long as they serve the interests of the capitalists. Thank you.
Thank you. Then our final question.
Okay, thank you. You know, Frantz Fanon writes that, you know, the anger of a black man is an open wound. And therefore, I fully agree with you, my brother, when you say that the methods that have been always employed during this protest, they still link to the pre-1994 era. And this is one of the findings that I encountered in my paper last year. So therefore, when we find ourselves in this, kleptocracy that we're in, where the state is so arrogant and gets away with almost everything, then how do we ensure that Marikana does not happen again? I mean, if something like this should it happen again, God forbid, how do we then hold the state accountable? And then equally, the sufferings that the families of the victims have gone through is quite concerning. And therefore, I want to know what has been the attitude and the contribution of AMCU and NUM to these families. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm gonna give it to the panelists in order from. Okay, we'll start from. Okay, Asenati will start, then we'll have Julian, and then we'll have Koketso. And maybe wrap that in there with your parting shots, right? What is the last thing that you actually want people to know? The case will go to court. What are all the things that we should make sure we leave here with?
I'll start with the question around protests and violence, and whether protest should still be an avenue that we consider, for us to voice our issues. I don't think that protest should be subsequent with violence. It's not something that should be happening, but it is something that happens anyway. And my sister Koketso gave us a background understanding of what the police is as we see it today. The police force under the apartheid was formed just before the formation of the South African Union in 1910. And it was formed because 4 different colonies decided that individually they were struggling to manage and suppress the dissenting voices coming from the ground. And as a result, they decided to amalgamate and form what was called the South African Police Force, with the intention of de-escalating dissenting voices from the ground. And that was the manifesto of their establishment from the onset. And during apartheid, all the way until 1994, they manifested what they were established to exist for. And the transition, in my opinion, to a democratic government and the transition to a now South African police service did not involve the actual systemic overhaul of the police in terms of their procedures, their policies, and their standards. And as a result of that history being very much influential into how the police operate today, we are bound to witness elements of violence when they deal with protests. Because the previous regime was not interested in entertaining the protest. They were interested in de-escalating the protest using violent methods. And certainly those violent methods are still being employed by the South African Police Force. Because there wouldn't be a justification for the level of weaponry that our police use during protests. The only justification they would have is that this is how things have always been done. But they were done by a regime that was perpetuating hate against a certain racial class in the country. But now it's different. We have a police service that is supposed to uphold human rights, that is supposed to deal with protests according to the book, avoiding all forms of violence, which is not happening. And as I had said, there's so much that we witness on a daily basis that shouldn't be happening. And more importantly, shouldn't be accepted as a reality. A protest is a constitutional right. If you wish to insist on your opinion or your position and you are not being heard, you are not being heard through the available procedures, you insist on your voice through protest. And we cannot give up on protest. We owe it to the generation of 1960. We owe it to the generation of 1976. We owe it to previous generations. We owe it to our loyalty to the Constitution, because it is a constitutional right. And we cannot give up on protest because of the repression that we experience from the police. The problem clearly is not protest. The problem is now the police. So how do we ensure that the police go through the necessary reforms to allow our people to freely practice their right to political freedom? The achievement of a democratic regime came about with the achievement of a free and secured political space. And that space should be free and secured from police and brutality and police violence. And we need to protect it. We need to make efforts towards protecting that space. We cannot abandon the entirety of protests simply because the police are displaying violence against us. The other question was around protest and litigation, and I don't think that it's a matter of either or. For me, I think these are all necessary tools of ensuring that your voice is heard. And I think that they can go hand in hand. It is not all scenarios that can be solved through litigation in court. It is not all scenarios that can be presented to court for litigation that we actually get what we wanted out of the litigation. Different scenarios require different approaches. If I could wear my political cap right now, I would speak much more on that. The other question was around whether the mine and the media are taking any accountability for their role in characterizing Marikana as what it is and in not realizing meaningful justice. When it comes to the mine, it's true, they haven't come to the table in relation to the Justice Project. They have established a trust that takes care of the children of the deceased mine workers, but that is not justice to its full extent. It is not justice that accounts for the role of the mine in concocting with the police and concocting with government in ensuring that what came about as Marikana happened. So I wouldn't want to speak much on that. I would just mention that they haven't taken any form of accountability, and it is up to them to present what they think is necessary and is meaningful accountability that they have actually realized over the years, and would actually hear what they have to say. Lastly, how do we avoid Marikana? How do we avoid an event like Marikana from occurring? I think that there is still so much that needs to be done in relation to the police as a public service. But there's also so much to be done from the perspective of the state. We do need a government that speaks for us. We do need a government that speaks for the poor and actually does something for the poor. We do need a government that speaks for the exploited. Sadly, in 2024, some of the most exploited workers in the country are mine workers and farm workers. And it's a quagmire that comes from the previous regime, adopted by the new regime and preserved for its tenure. And we do perhaps need to look into those aspects of society and evaluate whether the police are policing the right way. Evaluate whether there is respect of human rights and there is elements of Ubuntu in how the police conduct themselves. Evaluate how the state responds to this kind of atrocities. The government has had 12 years to respond to Marikana, at least 8 years after the Marikana Commission, and they haven't administered meaningful justice, whether it's in relation to civil, which is contentious, or in relation to the criminal aspect of the Justice Project, which is entirely dependent on the state to simply prosecute. Prosecute whoever gave the commands that people must be shot, prosecute whoever took that command and shot people, prosecute everyone who is responsible for the wrongdoing on the ground in Marikana. I will tread carefully on the AMCU question, because our role in Marikana is in relation to the widows. And because our involvement in Marikana is in relation to client-attainer relationship, And when we pursued the litigation, it was under the 5 prayers or demands that I had mentioned. And all of the accountability that had to be taken in relation to those 5 demands that were made were pointing towards the direction of the state and the police. Because it is undisputed that the people who died in Marikana on 13 and 16 August were killed by the police. The circumstances, the facts around it can be contentious later, but the actual fact is that they were killed by the police. And we had to take instructions from the families to pursue litigation against the Minister of Police as a custodian of the police. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Julian?
All right, let me just make 1 or 2 very brief points in response to some, but by no means all of the questions. The question around litigation and protest, Asenati is exactly right. They are both tactics. They are tactics that go hand in hand very often in post-apartheid South Africa, along with petitions, along with trying to get local politicians on your side, along with the media. There is no movement, no matter how large or how small in this country, who hasn't tried all and any of the above at some point. Sometimes you're lucky and the petitions work. Sometimes the protests are necessary, and sometimes the protests become too great a risk to continue. Litigation is a tool, not a panacea. There is a real danger in suggesting that any one form of activism will solve a political problem. Nothing will solve everything. In some cases, litigation will be effective. In other cases, protest is what is needed. And in some, if you're very lucky, petitioning the state and getting the right audience will work. You have to try everything. And the one thing that I think I should say is that I really believe that no one should tell any movement, Abishalali or anyone else, what they ought to be doing. It is their decision to take whatever the successes and failures that follow from that. For democratic politics to mean anything, it must mean that you are free to choose which methods you use to push forward. I am significantly more cynical than you are about the police. I don't think training and rules and ensuring better quality policing will do more than slowly and in a minor way mitigate the fundamental structural force that lies behind the police. So long as we have a society that is structured around an armed group of people whose role it is to preserve order, and so long as order is defined as the lack of disruption of the ordinary regimes of our lives, middle class and up more often than not, the police, however well trained, however constrained by law, will be a source of violence. But I don't want to end on that cynical, depressing, bitter note. What I do want to say is that there is something really significant about the fact that 12 years after the Marikana massacre, we are here, we are talking about it, and we are asking the question, will there be another Marikana? History has taught us that everywhere in the world there will be. But I can think of very few 12-year stretches in the history of South Africa before 1994 where the question of, will there be another massacre, is even vaguely relevant. We are in a period in which the state is complicit in a massacre, but it is not massacring every day in the way it once was. And it is minimal comfort, but we are in a situation where we are still horrified by a massacre that took place 12 years ago. Our politics still involves it, and it has not been forgotten. We cannot prevent the possibility of another massacre happening, because so long as we have the structures of power we have, it will. But we can make them rare. We can make them horrific, and we can make them something that everybody recognizes is a moral outrage and not just a political inconvenience.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would also second that, just in terms of new rules. We've seen a lot of new rules come since 1994, put in place and so on, right? But the structural forces remains, you know? Yeah, and if that remains unchanged, the outcome will remain the same. In terms of the stuff around tactics and creating change, one thing I want to tell you, I want to share is, I remember many conversations people would have, you know? Is it policy first? Is it going to change anything? Or is it we have to change people's actions every day? And to the point, different moments, different things require different tactics. When I was a kid, there was a time, the homeland was Bophuthatswana. There were these BTH buses. In the bus, people would smoke. In the taxi, people would smoke. Everywhere you went, people would smoke. When I started school, when I was in Sabe and Sabi, the teachers smoked in the classroom, and they would even send us to go get them cigarettes. Today, it is so unthinkable. It is so unthinkable for a lot of people under a certain age to even imagine me just taking out a cigarette and lighting it, right? And that is because tobacco control happened. Tobacco control required so many different players as well, right? It required the researchers. It required people whose lives had been damaged by smoking. It required this and that and that and that, right? But when the policy came, the behavior has changed. So I never think it's either or. I think it's always both and. And there's so much creativity that can be exercised around it, you know? But for me, it is just one of those things that stands out. Tobacco control, like, again, for my children, it is unimaginable that a teacher would take out a cigarette and smoke in class, and for a whole generation of people. And that is very important to keep in mind. When you are creating change, you are not at the center of the world. In many ways, you are on the periphery. You're challenging, you know, institutions with so much more capacity and resources. You are on the edge. What makes us powerful and able to move closer to the center is that collective work. Everybody playing their different roles, right? It could be litigation here. It could be protest here. It could be documenting a narrative here. It is all of that and more that is required. Now, the other thing is also what we're fundamentally talking about here. Inequality constrains agency, and every action people take is a rejection of those constraints, and that is important, and we see the outcomes. It was once upon a time, you know, thought of as impossible to be talking about a living wage, or 12,500 is too much for some people. We talk about it now, all these years later, right? I want you also to remember one video that always comes to my mind is when the workers at Wits were insourced and the reaction of those workers, right? That was so beautiful, you know? These outcomes, yes, you may not get everything in the moment, but the outcomes matter because we need to think of it as a path forward, a step in the right direction, you know? And so it does all count, all of these different tactics and yeah, coming together in that way. And again, this recognition and this expression of agency, there is something about affirming to the self and to the collective about being seen and being heard and making that demand, you know? That is important in a system that tells you your life does not matter, your voice does not matter, and you as a human being do not matter. So in terms of this stuff around solidarity and so on, I think the fundamental starting point is recognizing each other's humanity, right? When they attempt to manufacture consent, that it is okay for this armed group to take out their guns and shoot because people had gone to a witch doctor and had invisibilized themselves. We must reject it, you know? You don't know who it will be. The moment you accept it with one group, it happens to others and it keeps escalating. And just to give you a sense of how easily these things happen, when I stayed in Tshwane, I used to use the train, the Prasa train. So I used to stay in Atteridgeville. It was the early days there. When I got to the train station, the timetable, the train was still working, right? But there was nobody where you buy tickets. I got on the train and assumed when I get to town, there will be people where you can pay the ticket. What was waiting there for us was the police. They put us in the back of vans and demanded bribes from us. You didn't have cash, you gave them the cash, you didn't have money to go home, right? But again, it's this constant dehumanization that is always happening everywhere, and the possibility that violence will be turned on you. And so again, when we normalize it for anyone, we must recognize we normalize it for ourselves, for those we care about, and for everybody else around us too.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to all the questions and everyone for being such an incredible audience. Just on the media thing, I do want to just note that the media did a lot of important work to actually uncover a lot. The state was definitely running with a particular narrative, and the media did an important job to uncover so much more that we might have not known. So it's not all bad on the media front.
Wow. Sure. Mine workers, cold, stunned from the consistent songs of the discriminated makwerekweres, them jeeper clang, the spins are late and pedestrian walk of shame in the morning. My theory is simple. I work hard for your limbs. I lift the heavy arguments, blood-stabbing sins for your yell of approval of my manhood. I lift the jealous cases about Dlamini Kohlakele, the mpimpi accusations, the spells and nyoka yomlilo, the xenophobic death threats and necklace, the tuberculosis pit, the baboons, the black on black tribal madness, and the persistent orchestra of imaginary black cats, baboons and midgets, the aim of armed, beretted enforcers of white privilege. Matanasa, I dig this continent. Matanasa, I dig this continent with no more than a candle of death on my forehead. Nenhlamba kafomo nwebhunu elingazothi silala kanjani kule hostel engenagesi, sigeza kanjani ebhakede enembobo, sosa kanjani amaqanda ngekhandlela, siphosha kanjani esigigini, and the number of innocent cows we kill for good luck and better positions in these mines. All of this is for what? Matanasa, the river of my poverty, comrades' blood still meanders this platinum-infested hole where death visits me in the night and takes me to places far away from these fat privatizing pigs. A story whose ending is, as I now know, of black boys shooting and eating their children. Each night in this hole, death plays yo-yo games with my soul. Matanasa, my forbidden fortnight Josie fruit. I hope never to hope again. In your wretched arms, I'm content. Your concrete kiss is tenderness to my lips, penetrated dry and harsh from drinking 20 promises of Menel Ramaphosa and his multinational fathers. And no fire pool known to man can ever extinguish the burning passion which engulfs me each time I knock on your door to get hurt. I know that I'm a rock star fired from the depth of Mother Earth for demanding a bigger peanut. I'm thinking my sweet and affordable Baula perfume, Coach Lake Kikaba Matanasa Ozala. Matanasa Nkupaganzi. Kupela belonga abafundo ngazi sibongo. Bangibiza ngokahisho athi ngilokishi. My existence has no meaning. Ngimfene kulo foreman. Ngumthakathi kulezi zase hostel. Nalo ngibalisela ngento yokulala. Ungivala ngesikweleti samazenke. Ujeni ukhathele. Abanye bathi ngimiyeka ngoba abanye bathi ujola negebengu. Matanasa, my wife emaplazini akaBhilankulu. Udla ipilisi ngekerif. Uphelezele clinic ngekerif. She has written to me countless telegrams. Engincenga ukuthi ngibuye ekhaya. Abantwana bathi bagcina ubaba ngonyaka ozingomnyama. Abazabe ngamadoda, nothing comes to the crying birds if birds do cry. Besides, Matanasa has promised to marry me once I'm done with his mines.